But I'm glad to hear it because, at least for me, it's until like yesterday, it was a really tough spring because it really wasn't. I don't know about you, but it seemed to me that this whole winter thing was saying, okay, let's just do this all the time. Thank you very much. And I tell people, as I told them at the e-worship earlier today, that a little over 8 years ago when I was knowing I was going to come here, I had a friend in New York who grew up in Michigan, and she took me to one side and said, you need to know something about Michigan. 4 seasons. Almost winter. Winter. Still winter. And road construction. And of course, this year, still winter and road construction, they're overlapping a lot, right? But of course, reluctant spring is not unique to us here in Michigan. My first Easter in Massachusetts back in 1978 when I was a student minister, that Easter Sunday, 6 inches of snow fell. Up in Vermont where my folks lived for about 30 years, it's April, which means it's maple sugar season, which means there's still snow. Well, that's what you have inside the house. That's why they have mud rooms. Can you imagine a whole room devoted to mud? That's how bad it got. And a long time ago, when our children were little and we were traveling west to a meeting, we stopped at Yellowstone Park in the middle of June, my wife's birthday, June 13th. Woke up that morning to snow up in Wyoming. We think our souls live inside our bodies, but if we're honest, we'll admit that we need to touch the earth, sense the sky. We need to know fellow creatures are in it with us, and they affect our mood all the way through life, and that's part of what I want to talk about today. And likely that's why you're here. You could do all the thinking you want at home, but together there is a kind of energy that doesn't exist alone. So may the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be found true in thy sight, thou who art my rock and my redeemer, as I seek to speak the words we all share. One of the things I've realized is that cold is a relative experience, that when you're a kid, you can't wait to get out in the snow and throw the snowballs and build the forts and the snow people. I'm 60. The bloom is off that rose, babe. I tell people that 3/4 of cold is old. It gets harder and harder to get excited about the cold weather. I have what is called Raynaud's syndrome, when your extremities turn numb in the cold. So this is the first day I've walked to church since December that I haven't worn gloves. It's wonderful. But until yesterday, up until that day, up until that Friday, I was like Melville's Ishmael, you know who I mean, the guy at the beginning of Moby Dick who says, whenever I find myself growing grim about the mouth, whenever it is damp, drizzly November in my soul, whenever I find myself involuntarily pausing before coffin warehouses or bringing up the rear of every funeral I meet, it requires strong moral principle to prevent me from deliberately stepping into the street and methodically knocking people's hats off. Have you ever felt like that? That's kind of my default position in winter. Maybe I'm just melancholy by nature. That was my father, by the way. And of course, apples can't roll too far from those trees. But it seems to me that along with your personal disposition, along with the weather, there's something else that makes the grim and drizzlies more likely. If you're a seeker of truth, that'll do it. Every time you go looking for the truth, you learn it, and then you're really disappointed at the outcome, aren't you? We want the world to be magical and full of promise, and every time we turn on the news, it's one more miserable thing after another. Whoever decides, I'm going to live by the truth no matter what, will find herself or himself saying, is there anything worth believing in? Now, this is not news. You can go all the way back to Ecclesiastes, who starts the book with these words: vanity, vanity, all is vanity. It's useless, meaningless. This is the Bible, mind you. I'm not making this up out of whole cloth. That whole famous passage about being a time and a purpose for everything under heaven, and Pete Seeger, and was it The Birds or something like that? That's right in the middle of one of the most downer books in the Bible. Here's what Ecclesiastes really says. I said to myself, come now, I will test you with pleasure to find out what is good. But that proved meaningless. Laughter, I said, is madness. And what does pleasure accomplish? I tried cheering myself with wine and embracing folly. My mind still guided me to wisdom. I wanted to see what was good for people to do under the heavens during the few days of their lives. Those who live by truth alone are doomed. It seems that we who are devoted to the truth always walk in the valley of Schopenhauer's shadow, or, in these other words from Oscar Wilde, also from The Importance of Being Earnest. Gwendolyn, he writes, it is a terrible thing for a man to find out suddenly that all his life he has been speaking nothing but the truth. Can you forgive me? We prefer our delusions because the truth is always disappointing, isn't it? We can imagine better things than reality. So I'm here to tell you, and this is my first message in all of this, is that truth is not enough to live on. It is not a substantial, adequate, or complete spiritual diet. You do need it, like your roughage and your protein and your vitamins, but it is not enough. We need truth, absolutely. To live for a falsehood would be to die before dying, but as Ecclesiastes reminds us, with much wisdom comes much sorrow. The more knowledge, the more grief. Actually, I prefer Woody Allen's version, and I bet you do too. He said, life is full of misery, loneliness, and suffering, and it is all over much too soon. If we live only by what we know to be true, by what we really know, we will be almost hopeless. And that's my second message. In addition to truth, we need hope, even when the truth does not tell us where it is. If there is a universal kernel in the seed of every religion, it is that we are the creature that hopes without any good reason. And of course, spring is the season when we look around and say, well, there must be something worth hoping for. Look, the flowers have come up, the sun has come out, the birds are chirping. Something good is happening. And true to form, my daffodils are up. There are buds on the skeletal trees. Insects appear ex nihilo, created by God just to annoy me. My asparagus is actually growing again. There is a reason we say hope springs eternal. Little wonder that the two biblical faiths celebrate their most important holidays in the spring, Passover and Easter, when the earth seems to come back to life and offer a promise of a future. But then again, Edna St. Vincent Millay's poem reminds us that our hope is always balanced with a certain measure of futility. Kind of like April itself. April in Michigan in particular. It's all promise, rare delivery. Yes, my daffodils are up. I saw them through the snowflakes. My crocuses came up and were beaten back into submission by the sleet that fell. Then the river overflows and the mud creeps up. Plagues worthy of a Midwestern pharaoh. And when spring hesitates week after week after week, we are left between the cross and the empty tomb. Which one is true? Where do we find hope? Honest hope, I mean the real thing, not wishful thinking that requires you to close your eyes and stop your ears. That's the challenge. Real hope, genuine hope, lasting hope, the kind that actually includes the truth in it. And fortunately, we're not alone. You're not alone. I'm not alone. We can follow others who have walked this way. Ecclesiastes continues, for example. Remember what he said, or she said, we have no knowledge of who wrote it. He was going to find out whether pleasure was worth it all, and he decided no, it wasn't. At the same time Ecclesiastes is writing, there's a fellow in Greece named Epicurus. He's saying, life is just what it is. Avoid pain, seek pleasure, die happy. Now that sounds selfish, but actually he believed that we had to be good to other people in order to have good for ourselves. So he was a champion of the golden rule. So pleasure is good, but here's the problem with pleasure. Have you heard of the hedonic treadmill? It's easy to explain. Do you love chocolate ice cream? Yes. Now eat it and nothing else for the rest of your life. That would be hell, wouldn't it? Pleasure repeated over and over again becomes pain. So a life that's only for pleasure cannot ultimately be satisfying.